Why don't we get started? I do not see Dr. Bacus. I hope he remembered. He had it on his calendar, I know that, so we shall see. But anyhow, we do have one of the two Bobs. We have Bob Tortolani, from Brattleboro, the big city. We thought we would have an urban doctor and a rural doctor.
Exactly right. I'm the urban guy.
Bob has been a friend of mine for a number of years, and his medical service includes service in Vietnam during the war. He's been a family practitioner in Brattleboro, now retired, I believe, completely.
Yep.
Former president of the Vermont Medical Society, so a number of very good credentials. He also has a very strong interest in history. Is involved in his own little historic restoration project currently on the New Hampshire side of the river, even though he's in Brattleboro. He has a camp over there, which has attracted his attention. So Bob is going to start. If Bob Bacus comes, my initial thought was that we would give each of the two doctors about a half hour, and then we would have a chance to ask questions. So we will start on that basis and go forward. So,
well, thank you, Dick. Appreciate it. By the way, thank you all for coming. I'm very impressed with the number of people who left the beautiful Friday afternoon, in came to this. And I hope you're here for the right event. Anyway.
We did advertise air conditioning.
And I also wanted to thank you for the air conditioning. Dick is indeed a friend, and I would never say no to a friend. And he asked if I would say something about, medicine history and history of medicine in Windham County, kind of a big topic. I wasn't sure whether he was insinuating that, Bob Bacus and I were a significant part of the history because we're so darn old. We know about the history of Windham County and medicine. I think probably a little of each. I've known Bob Bacus for a long, long time, and if he's not going to show up today, it's because something very serious came up with him. I know that. Anyway, I think that it's, first I want to say hello to our community television. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. And
at your service.
I think it would be not true to speak of the history of medicine in Windham County without saying that the history started well before the white settlers, colonists got here. Clearly, the Native Americans had their own medical system, which probably was superior to what we had as colonists in the early 1600s and 1700s. And certainly, we've got to acknowledge the fact that there was a medical history and medical treatment here well before the people came from the south. And the first settlement, as most of you know, was in Brattleboro, Fort Dummer, and the first white human being was born in Vermont, as far as we know, shortly after in the 1720s. And I don't know if there was a midwife there or whether that mother birthed on her own or whether there was a clinician of some sort. I really don't know. We don't have that information. But I do know the first white, it was a girl who was born in the 1720s at Fort Dummer. I see Dr. Bacus coming. So that's the first disclaimer. Secondly, this has always been a pretty popular place. Hey, Robert.
Hey, Robert.
Welcome. Welcome. I got to start because I was here first.
You've always been there first.
I was saying, I want you to know, I was saying I've known you for a heck of a long time, and it's always a pleasure to be anywhere with Bob Bacus. But anyway,
I'm going to say that.
We've already had 4 Bob Bacus jokes. So
yeah.
We've been here
So, and I was introduced, Bob, as the city guy, and you're the country guy.
Country mouse.
So, yeah, Brattleboro was incorporated in 1753, and quickly grew. I believe our first physician in Brattleboro was a guy by the name of Willard Arms, A-R-M-S. That was in 1804. But I don't know a heck of a lot about what was going on in the medical field in Brattleboro, in the big city of Brattleboro, the county, not the county seat because that's Newfane, but the county cultural and business area where we had multiple hospitals. We had at least 3 hospitals in Brattleboro. We'll talk about that a little bit later. What I wanted to say as a little background is that we are fortunate to have some very interesting and good medical institutions of higher learning in medicine here. University of Vermont, and Bob is a graduate of the University of Vermont. I did my postgraduate work at the University of Vermont. The importance of this is if you have a very good medical institution of higher learning, many of those people who do their training either as a medical student or as an intern and resident will actually settle in the state where they did the training. So having University of Vermont Medical School started in 1822, it's the 7th oldest medical school in the United States. It closed for about 15 years, like a lot of them in the 1830 or 1840 range, but then came back and it's been alive and well ever since, very well indeed. Dartmouth started in 1797 as a medical school, always had been for a long time a medical school with only a 2-year curriculum because it was such a rural community that to get to the the years where you're seeing a lot of patients, they just didn't have enough patients in Hanover, New Hampshire, and they sent people out. So it became a 4-year medical school about 50 years ago. Before that, it was a 2-year medical school. And interestingly, while Windham County has not had a medical school, Windsor County has had a medical school. That's the Woodstock Medical School, which was alive and well for about 25 years. The curriculum was 24 weeks of lectures, usually by no more than 2 or 3 doctors, and then 2 years of apprenticeship with 1 or more physicians, usually 1 physician. And that was the curriculum. And believe it or not, I heard that more people graduated from Woodstock Medical School, which was considered a rural medical school, again I'm highlighting the ruralness, versus an urban medical school like Harvard. Actually, and they weren't comparing them, they simply made the distinction. There's the rural medical schools and the urban medical schools. And the Woodstock Medical School graduated during its tenure more people than Harvard did, which is hard for me to believe. But again, we have to be a little not knowing exactly what the curriculum was and whatever. And the final thing I'll say is I just want to acknowledge, because I'm going to get to this later, the importance of women in the history of our county's medical history. Is the Blackwells were the first 2 women to graduate from medical school in Geneva Medical School, which no longer exists, in the early 1800s. And I would just go to say that many people went from the United States to Paris or Germany to continue their education. The center of medical education, probably in the 1800s, was Paris. They had tremendous numbers of clinical cases, in other words, patients. They just had a huge medical situation there, and a lot of the American doctors in training after they had their medical school went there for 2 or 3 years and got work through. So I want to talk a little bit more about, I wanted to say before that we have had Grace Cottage Hospital, BMH, the Brattleboro Retreat are 3 medical institutions that are very important and still alive and well. And Rockingham, as we probably know, was not able to continue and to exist beyond about 20 years ago. I think they closed in around 20 to 30 years ago. Rockingham had a very nice hospital, but financial problems had resulted in their demise, which is not uncommon for small community hospitals. My focus this evening is going to be on a couple of things. One is I want to tell you a little bit about a hospital, which was the largest hospital ever to be in Vermont, that many of you may not know very much about. And I wanted to talk to you about the importance of women in the creation of medical institutions in this county, because two women have had a tremendous influence on that. So I'm going to, I guess what I'm going to do is start with, chronologically, with the Brattleboro Retreat. The Brattleboro Retreat, as you probably know, is one of the oldest institutions for the care of mentally ill in the United States. It started in 1835, and the first superintendent there was named Rockwell, R-O-C-K-W-E-L-L. He was very well known, and it was kind of an exciting thing to get him to come to this rural institution. Now, how did we ever get a mental hospital here in Brattleboro, Vermont? Good question. It takes money, it takes interest, it takes someone who's got something, particularly money, but also a zeal, energy, okay? And that person was Anna Hunt Marsh. Anna Hunt Marsh was the daughter of the Lieutenant Governor of Vermont at that time, Lieutenant Governor Hunt. I know the Hunt Mansion near the nuclear power plant in Vernon, okay? She was the daughter of the Lieutenant Governor, and she was lucky enough to marry a general practitioner, Pearlie Hunt, from Hinsdale, okay? And from all I could tell, they had a very nice marriage. I'm sure she had her challenges being married to a general practitioner. It's not an easy life to be married to a general practitioner. I think all of us worry about our spouses, particularly if we're in primary care, what they have to put up with. But anyway, I'll go on to say that they had a very good relationship. But she was very, very affected by two or three things that she saw. One thing was she, during the late 1700s, it was they got married in the 1790s in Hinsdale, and somewhere in the 1790s, a nephew came to spend the summer, and that nephew was mentally ill. And she was very, very upset by what she saw with him. She lived with a young man who, I don't know whether he was psychotic or whether he had some other mental depression. We don't really know the details, but she was very affected by this young man's condition, and she felt very bad about him, and she didn't know what to do, and she felt helpless, and she learned a lot about mental illness by living with him for a summer. The other thing is, she was around when her husband, Pearlie, he was trying to help treat a man from Brattleboro who happened to be an attorney who had a psychosis. He was very severely, we call it schizophrenia. He was a man who was very, very ill. And the treatments then were, you've heard of shock treatment, electric shock treatment. They did not have electric shock treatment, but they did have cold water immersion treatment. And this is absolutely fascinating. In the home where this treatment took place, there is the tub made out of a tree that is the exact tub in which this man was immersed. And that is existing to this moment in Hinsdale. He was immersed in cold water for a period of time. You know, he could breathe, but his body was, he was very chilled. He was shocked. But it didn't take away his mental illness. So the next step was opium. He got a shot of opium, and the dosage was not correct or whatever, and the man died. Yeah, and she saw that, and it was very, very, very upsetting. And of course it was upsetting to everybody. It was tragic. But anyway, she saw the results of the treatment that caused the death of the patient, and we're always taught first do no harm. It's absolutely, I can't imagine that physician having to deal with the horror of seeing his patient die after he was given the treatment. I think, everyone's trying to do good by him, but it didn't work. So those were the things that led her to be so affected. Now, I don't know if any of you know, on Route 119, as you're going from Brattleboro to Hinsdale, about 3-4 miles down, on the right is a beautiful colonial house. And that house was initially built by Reverend Hinsdale. And that house actually was very close to a fort. I think it was Fort number 2 on the Connecticut River, which has some of the results are still in the neighborhood there. But it's an amazing property. That house was built in 1769 and really is very unchanged from 1769, except that Anna Marsh in 1804 built a little addition on the west side of this beautiful house. And that addition was entirely for the arts performances. She was really into music, poetry, whatever. And she built this little addition. It has a nice fireplace at one end. It has a little kitchen at the other end. It's about maybe 20 feet long by about 15 feet wide. It's not very big, but it was for the performing arts, and that's pretty neat, okay? So, I'll just go and say that Pearlie Marsh unfortunately died in his 35 to 40 range. I don't think there were any children. She inherited whatever little money he had. She had enough at the time of her death, which was in 1834, to give $5,000 for the building of a mental hospital. That mental hospital was, that was a lot of money in those days. It wasn't enough to actually build the Tyler building, which is the large building as you come in on the left. That's the Tyler building. But they were able to buy a mansion there and a piece of land for $5,000. The state of Vermont gave $2,000, I think, times 3 or 4, so that they gave somewhere between $6,000 and $8,000 over the next 10 years, so that they were able to build this this hospital. And by 1835, the Tyler building was built, and that was the start of one of the oldest mental hospitals in the United States that happens to be in Little Brattleboro, Vermont, and it's still a very, I think, important institution. My hat's off to them for some of the programs that are very innovative to this day, such as first responder, PTS, post-traumatic stress syndrome, kind of treatment for people who are first responders. And in my mind, they're doing some very good work there, but I believe it's Brattleboro's second largest employer after CNS. I believe they have almost 1,000 employees, 900 employees. Anyway, if it weren't for Anna Hunt Marsh, that hospital would not be there, and probably tens and thousands of people would not have been able to be treated, okay? So that is the first of our 2 women, and I've got a lot more to say, but did you want to have each of us do 15 minutes and then come back for 15 minutes or more? Would you like me to finish?
Why don't you, I think it will help your flow if you just carry on. So
okay, very good. Okay, now
we're going to do roughly a half hour for each of the 2 doctors, and then try to have a half hour or so for questions.
I probably didn't have a half an hour of stuff to say, but I probably could get to 25 minutes. But anyway, I could write. I wanted to say what comes around goes around, and the Brattleboro Retreat was kind enough to give money in support of the renovation by the Hinsdale Historical Society, the renovation of the Anna Marsh addition that's on there. So the Hinsdale Historical Society has been trying to raise money for this, to make this again a performing arts center for this area. And the Brattleboro Retreat has been very generous and kind to give money towards a significant amount of money towards the renovation of that space. And so what comes around goes around. I think that's very, very interesting and very kind of them. Okay. So the next step is the 1840s in Brattleboro was an interesting time. A lot of music, a lot of culture, interestingly, in Brattleboro in the 1840s, 1830s. And Wesselhoff, who was a German physician, I guess a homeopathy physician, came to the United States looking for a place that had really good water. Okay? And he had his way of testing the water in various communities in the eastern United States. I don't think he went beyond New York State. But he said that, oh, he went into Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, he went as far west as Pennsylvania, which I guess would be almost the frontier in the 1840s. But at any rate, he found the Brattleboro water to be the best water he'd seen in the United States. I guess the German water was very good, but he would say the Brattleboro water was the best in the United States. So he decided to build what was called the Wesselhoff water cure that started in around 1840-ish, 42 I think, something like that. And that was quite a thing. It was right where the main Brattleboro Fire Department is right now. And across the street from that, where there's a couple of little eating establishments, was the Lawrence water cure, which Wesselhoff was doing so well. The competitor was the Lawrence, and it went across the street. And one of them had about 300 rooms, and the other one had about 100 or 150 rooms. This was a big deal. They had concerts, they had lectures, they had bands, they had trails, they had places on trails where you could dip yourself. They had all kinds of water treatments, drinking, immersion, whatever. It was something else, and people would come and live there for 6 months. The interesting thing is, the fifth most wealthy civilization that we know of in the history of man, maybe that's a little too far, but believe it or not, it was the southern states, the United States, up until the 1860s. There was a huge amount of wealth there. And many people from the south who had rheumatism came to Brattleboro. Brattleboro was the spa, the water spa community in the United States at that time. And then they compared it to Saratoga. Saratoga Springs, more fancy, but not as clinical. We're better here. Brattleboro had a little bit more rustic. You know, if you want to go to Saratoga and you really want to, you know, just have an easy experience, go to Saratoga. Here, they put you through the mill. But anyway, they cured you, the water cure. Well, the interesting thing is that the problem with the abilities to pay for this is that we're running out of clientele. Once the Civil War started, there were none of the southern clientele that came up, and they're the people who had a lot of money. They would actually come for 6 months and stay and just live here. And they loved the northern climate, particularly in the summertime. You know, in the wintertime, they wouldn't have someone from Alabama coming up from October to April. That wouldn't, but they'd come up probably from April to October and stay, and it would help their rheumatism and help this and that, and they really had a good time. And I guess Brattleboro at that point was quite the town. I mean, it was a big deal. You see pictures, and I got a bunch of things over there, and you can probably see some of the stuff over there. Anyway, that ended with the Civil War. It was said that Stonewall Jackson and Harry Beecher Stowe were both residents there, but not at the same time. And had they been there at the same time, it would have been a very interesting conversation. And maybe the Civil War could have been not started. We'll see. All those kind of things. All right. Anyway, I'm going to segue to the next thing, which is very interesting to me, is the Civil War Hospital in Brattleboro. The Civil War Hospital in Brattleboro started in 1863, and again, we had 3 Civil War Vermont governors. One was Fairbanks from St. Johnsbury, one was Holbrook from Brattleboro, and one was Smith from St. Albans, 2 saints in Brattleboro. At any rate, Holbrook was a very good friend of Stanton, the Secretary of War And he was convinced that Vermont boys were dying needlessly from illnesses and wounds in Washington and Virginia hospitals, that if they could only get back to the Vermont air, and I think the Vermont hope, there would be a better chance they would survive. And he said, if the federal government would transport these folks to Brattleboro, we will take and provide the doctors. We will provide the nurses and the linens. We're not going to supply the supplies, the surgical equipment, but we'll supply the linens, and we'll supply the houses and the fires, to keep people warm. If you will get us there and provide doctors. And indeed, they did. He said, we'll give it a 6-month try. I don't believe Stanton thought this was going to work at all. But I don't think, just like I couldn't say no to Medicare, I don't think he could say no to Holbrook. I think they were just two good friends. To the great surprise and the wonderful result was that once men, even severely ill or injured men, got here, their rate of recovery was incredibly better than in the malarial infested swamps of, Washington was built on a swamp, basically, okay, whereas a tremendous amount of typhoid and malaria, and it was a god-awful place to get sick or to try to recover from an injury. It worked. There were 1,400 beds, 1,400. Medical Center Hospital, Vermont, when I was there, was a big hospital, about 650 or 700 beds. There was no hospital in Vermont ever to have 1,400 beds. And that 1,400 bed hospital was in the barracks, where 25,000 of the 36,000 Vermonters in the Civil War mustered in and out in Brattleboro. And many of the Brattleboro women married some of these men who were injured. It was very interesting. There are lots of little romances that occurred at that time, of course. But at any rate, the people, there were lots and lots of people here who were ill, and they got better. I believe not more than 100 people died of the 5,000 people who were treated here. Just remarkable, and many of them got back into service, of course. But the point was, it really did work. And the important thing is that not only did it work, but there were 2 more hospitals, one in Burlington, one in Montpelier, in Vermont, and hospitals all over the northern states. All the northern states started to build hospitals based upon the Brattleboro model. And so I am incredibly proud of Holbrook for doing that, for getting that first hospital established and actually being a model for saving the lives of probably tens of thousands of Union troops. Okay, finally, the final thing I'm going to talk about is the romance between Elizabeth Rowell Thompson and Thomas Thompson that led to the formation of the Brattleboro Hospital. Again, this is our second woman who I think is an all-star. Thomas Thompson was a rather eccentric millionaire in the 1850s who liked to travel to Vermont by coach. And he ran into this lovely lady by the name of Elizabeth Rowell, who grew up in poverty, and she was I believe she was in the Caledonia County area. Somehow they got together and they fell for each other, and they got married. And it was all I could tell, they had about a 30-year, he was a lot older than she was, but he lived another 25 to 30 years. But she was she married at 19, and she was a widow at 48. So they had about a 29-year marriage. She lived another 50 years. During their time together, they actually spent a lot of time in Brattleboro in the summers, or Rhinebeck, New York. Those were the 2 towns that they loved, and they got very involved with the seamstresses in these 2 towns. The seamstresses were hardworking. They didn't seem to have good care. They kind of a group that would give everything. and not get much in return. They made a specific point about the fact that so much of the time they spent making uniforms for the soldiers and doing things at the hospital. And at any rate, they felt very sorry for the seamstresses, and he and she decided at her death the money that was in her estate was going to go 2/3 to Brattleboro, 1/3 to Rhinebeck for the care of seamstresses and poor people, particularly women in these communities. But there was a thing in the, there was a little thing in the will that allowed them to say other things that would help the community. So, make a long story short, they figured out how they could build a hospital. They bought, much like the retreat, they bought something called Hemlocks, which was a mansion on the hill, which is where BMH is now. And then there's a lot of pictures of the development of Brattleboro Hospital. They basically, the money was given for buying the Hemlocks and then actually starting the first pavilion part, the old part of the hospital. And I don't know how many $1,000s it was, but it was a certain amount of money. And the other part of the money, the other money from that will went into what was called the trust, which exists today. It is the Thompson Trust has been so incredibly beneficial to the Brattleboro community for all kinds of things, and it's very well managed by a group of trustees in Boston. They come every year, and it's really kind of a nice story. The whole story of the romance, if you're really interested in the romance, there's a 2-page here, 2.5 pages on the romance, but I don't want to hold us back from Bacus. I want you to... You want the romance? All right, I'll give it to you. This is Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, romance, by Richard Wellman. Brattleboro's great legacy was its beginning in the year 1840 when the millionaire Thomas Thompson of Boston was vacationing in Vermont. Most millionaires are eccentric, and Mr. Thompson was no exception. He never traveled by train or steamboat, but rather made long carriage drives. It was on one such carriage drive that he casually met Elizabeth Roll, then 19 years of age, a true Vermont maid, born of sturdy stock, brought up under great hardships and privations, with practically no schooling, and at the age of 9, forced to go to domestic services at the wage of 25 cents a week. By contrast, Mr. Thompson was past middle age, a Harvard graduate, a man of culture, who inherited a fortune and a love for fine art. He accumulated a collection of paintings valued then at $500,000. Then at $500,000. Amazing. Elizabeth Rowell made such an impression on Thomas Thompson that he sought her further acquaintance in Boston. Okay. And in 1843, the cabin-born Green Mountain girl became Mrs. Thomas Thompson. On many occasions, the Thompsons were boarders at the Bliss Farm on Black Mountain Road in the summer, and at the Holbrook House on the Common, the Holbrook House on the Common, in the winter. It was during these visits that they became interested in the poor sewing women of Brattleboro who had gathered here to make garments for soldiers of the Civil War. During Thompson's life together, large sums of money were given to them to charity. And in 1861, when Mr. Thompson drew up his will with Mrs. Thompson's wishes and the advice of the estate was to be left in trust for Mrs. Thompson as long as she lived. And then the great legacy was the bequest for the benefit of the poor sewing women of Brattleboro, Vermont, and Rhinebeck, New York. So Mrs. Thompson became a widow at 48 with a very large annual income from the trust fund, which she used for philanthropic and charitable enterprises of all sorts. She lived a very simple life. Her tastes and desires were meager. She used only the income from the estate, never touching the principal. Her gifts to institutions and private individuals were very numerous. When a paralytic shock eventually overtook her and others took her business at hand, it was found that 28 families in one New England town where she was living were entirely dependent on her bounty. She died in 1899 in Littleton, New Hampshire. In 1901, Mr. Richard Bradley, says the county gentleman, was appointed trustee of the Thompson Trust, and under his administration, by court decree, 2/3 of the income from the estate was to go to Brattleboro, Vermont, 1/3 to Rhinebeck, New York. Although the sewing women were named as special beneficiaries, the court ruled that the phrase kindred charitable purposes would permit other activities, including the building of a hospital in Brattleboro. The county gentleman purchased the estate known as the Hemlocks, the George Hall Mansion on Canal Street, for the purpose of building the hospital. It was first called the Hemlocks Hospital, bad name actually. Opened in July 1, 1902 as an infirmary for sewing women and shop girls of Brattleboro. The name was later changed to Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, and the first patient admitted under the name of the Brattleboro Memorial Hospital was Vance Knuckles, N-U-C-K-E-L-S, a race driver who fractured his leg in an accident at the Valley Fair in September of 1904. The portraits of Mr. and Mrs. Thompson today adorn the walls of the hospital reception room. A bronze plaque, a copy of it is in their honor at the Thompson House on Maple Street, and in the main entrance of the hospital in Belmont Avenue is a huge monument to the memory of the Thompsons. So anyway, two very nice relationships, the Marshes and the Thompsons. And I just want to say that I felt very, very lucky to find Brattleboro Hospital. I think I got here in the fall of '73, and I remember seeing Bob doing some work in the radiology and kind of getting, you're in either medical school or just getting ready to go to medical school, and we got to know each other, I believe 1973 or the very latest '74, so we've known each other for a very, very long time. And at any rate, it's been a wonderful thing, and I just wanted to say that I just had I had a meeting at our house of the old-timers of our medical staff just the other day, and you know, most of whom are retired except for John Glick, who's still hanging in there, and he left his office for the afternoon to join us, so that was very, very nice. And we had 13 of the people in that picture. I just want to say that the first picture I saw of the medical staff of Brattleboro Hospital, Dr. Burnett, very early woman physician, you'll see her picture on a horse back there. Very, very nice picture. She and all the other guys, there were 12 guys and Grace Burnett. That would have been probably 1930s, 33, 34. And that picture was 73. There were 30. In 34, there were 13 or 14 staff. In 1982, there were 30. Now there's over 100 on the medical staff. And of course, we also have Grace Cottage. And the county population hasn't changed that much. Brattleboro is the same population it was 100 years ago. It's about 10,000 to 12,000. It hasn't changed. So at any rate, having done my training in Vermont, I fell in love with Vermont and its people and decided to stay here. One of the best decisions of my life, really. So anyway, I forgot to say one other thing when I was talking about the Rockwell and the retreat. I found a letter that was written by Rockwell to Mr. Haskell of Wethersfield, Vermont in 1846. This is called a stampless folded letter. This is stamps started in 1847 in the United States, except for the provisionals, which started in the 1840s, which were testing stamps. The real stamps, the stamps that became the official postage for the United States, after a period of time after which they started, you couldn't use these stampless letters. But these are letter sheets that are folded, and it's not like this, and it's generally not prepaid. It's generally paid by the recipient. I'm sure that Mr. Merrick is going to give you a talk on that at some point. We have an equal interest in these things. But at any rate, this was the bill for a family member. And it's written, this is a bill for approximately a year and a quarter of the care of this person at the Brattleboro Retreat. including the person's clothing and his, when he died, his coffin, and the robe that he wore in his coffin, and to get a sense for what the cost was for 5.5 weeks of care, it was $7.93. For 52 weeks of care in 1846, it was $70.26. The coffin was $4.50. The robe and other grave clothing were $2. Something I can't read was something else. And I believe this claim was rejected by Blue Cross Blue Shield. I'm not sure, it doesn't say that, but it is clear that Rockwell did not have a secretary. He was the secretary, he was the business person, he was the doctor, he was the treasurer, he was it. So he's sending this family member, somehow someone paid something, and the bill to this man was $63.54. I'll leave this up there for you to look at. It's quite fascinating. Okay, I just wanted to say, I think we are all lucky to be in Windham County. It's a very, very interesting place from the standpoint of its history in Vermont, its culture. And I believe we have very, very high quality medical care. Grace Cottage Hospital, Brattleboro Hospital. The rural hospital, of course, Grace Cottage, the city hospital, Brattleboro. This is almost a spoof. But I would just say that I believe that we are all fortunate, and we're getting to the point where I'm always making sure my care is good. I'm very, very happy with basically the way medicine is practiced in this part of the country. And we're very lucky to be here. So I want to thank you for listening, and I appreciate very much your attention.
Anybody need to pee? Go ahead.
First things first, right?
First things first.
I thought it was convenient to have two Bobs here, so I wouldn't be confused about the name.
Yeah, that's good. Don't worry.
When I saw you coming in, I have to because as you probably remember, I volunteered as an EMT for about 3 or 4 years. And if you came into Grace Cottage Hospital at 2 in the morning with a patient, there was a better than 50-50 chance that you'd see somebody zipping in, looking just about like you did when you came in. I don't know when you ever slept. And then Bob, after the patient was treated, would proceed to give you a brief and very enlightening little mini seminar on what had happened and what the prognosis would be for somebody in that condition and how they should be treated and so on. And it was like, you know, a little mini form of medical school. So it was great fun, and it brought back that memory as it came down. Having said that, I will give you the lectern, and such as it is. We'll let you go, and then we're going to do questions for maybe a half hour afterwards.
Well, first of all, I'd like to speak about Bob Tortolani. He is a unique, caring, very intelligent, curious, wonderful man. And he was one of the people who helped me move along into the field of medicine, for which I forgive him. He has just been an inspiration, and the whole area is just blessed to have you, Robert.
Oh, wow. That's versatile.
So, my charge was different than Bob's. Dick asked that I look back on what changes I have seen since I came to Vermont. I'll give you a little bit of my own family history. My mother's family, the Walcotts, fled persecution, religious persecution in England, and arrived in the United States by ship in 1629. My father's family, the Bacuses, came over for the same reason, although I think they were probably fleeing the Bow Street runner. They came in 1630. Now, as happened in those days, you know, people migrated up this waterway out here, up the Connecticut River, if you arrived in looking for land to settle and to start their families. So, you do know Fort Dummer. I'm sure all of you are aware of that. Well, it seems that one of the Walcotts, who was the head of the Walcott clan at the time, was coming upriver, hoping to settle in the Northeast Kingdom. And along that trip, once she got into Fort Dummer, she met this handsome fellow named Mr. Severance. Now, do you guys remember Don Severance? Well, Donnie Boy told me the story. He said, yeah, we're cousins. I said, what do you mean we're cousins? He said, well, one of yours took care of one of mine and she got pregnant, so upriver they went. The family wouldn't take her back. So they went up. My mom's family founded Walcott in the kingdom, and my dad's family settled over in Colebrook, New Hampshire, back and forth across the border. So I'm still a flatlander because I was born in Los Angeles. But I do have some Vermont in me. I came to Vermont in '65 after I'd been overseas. And I worked for the Experiment, and then eventually went back overseas and came back. In 1970, started taking my final courses to become a doctor with the University of Massachusetts program in Dartmouth. I completed those and then went to med school at UVM in '72. When I graduated from med school, I graduated a fair bit early because I wanted to do a residency overseas in Australia, because at that time they had an incredible program of training for family physicians. I mean, just fantastic, and I was blessed to have it. I mean, it's just, I won't bore you with all the details, but the Aussies are fun, and their beer is very good too. But we came back home because Jan's father, my first wife, Jan's father had cancer, and they didn't think he was going to make it. So we came home, and an opportunity had opened up with Dr. Otis, because Jack Allen, who had been with him, went on into his residency program, and Carlos was all alone in the valley again, which he had been at the time. So he hired me on. That's a story which I will. So I come into his office and it's April. Cold. So I come shuffling in with my sweatshirt on and my Levi's and my Birkenstocks. And he looks at me like this, you know. He said, "You come to interview like this?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Eunice, come in here. You got a goddamn hippie here." That's how we started off the relationship. And Carlos and I battered on each other for the whole time he was around. So I had the privilege of working with Carlos, whom every one of you in this crowd knows, and I'm sure loved and respected. This was a man who was the last of the really true old family physician doctors in this area. A lot of the other folks had gone on. He, as you know, had his nose in everything. But what he did for this valley, with the help of all of you, was just unbelievable. Imagine working 365 days out of the year for your entire career, and that's Carlos. He came in 38. One of my favorite stories of his first coming was he told me that about several months after he'd arrived, spring had arrived, and he noticed that patients coming in were getting yellow in their eyes, and they didn't feel well. Well, they had hepatitis A. They all had hepatitis A, and so he tracked it. He did a little epidemiology. He tracked it from the easternmost and southernmost and northernmost and westernmost points, and found that every one of these people who lived on the bank of the river that runs through Townsend, passed and through, Leland and Gray and down to Newfane and down this way. All of them were involved in this. So he did a little more epidemiology, and he went and found that everyone there had no toilet. So their sewage went into the brook. So here's this guy, new to town, wants to make a good impression, right? So he goes to the first house and says, look, I think I figured out why all you guys have this hepatitis stuff. It's because, your feces are running into the brook. So what I, as the town health officer, need to do is tell you, you got to build a shitter. Well, I said, again, if we're doing that, we didn't need one before, we don't need it now. What makes you think it? So this battle went on. So finally, Carlos said to one of them, God damn it, I'll dig the first hole. But you got to put a shitter on it. And the guy did. And that started this whole thing, all the way down the valley to the outhouses started to appear. I think that's a wonderful story. And it's true. So anyway, when I arrived and started working with him, he was just a font of knowledge of the history of medicine and stuff. And he was just so dedicated. I mean, I don't think any of you guys got stiffed in the middle of the night if you called him and said, I'm sick, I need to see you. And that alone says wonders. So here he is. He's making his way, but he realizes that you guys deserve a hospital. And he launches the idea through all of you people and your relatives, and you supported it, and you made it happen with Carlos's guidance. And it is probably one of the most wonderful little places that I've ever worked in my life. People were kind, people were funny, people were damn well easy enough to tell you when you're on the wrong boat, mate. And if you don't hurry up, we're going to ship yours out of town. No, it's just a wonderful place. And we have attracted over the years some wonderful physicians. But the one physician whom I remember from when I first came here that was just as inspirational as Carlos was Dr. Elizabeth Crengery. And some of you had your children by Elizabeth because she was allowed to deliver here. Elizabeth Crengery was the first woman doctor to come out of the med school in UVM and settled up in Londonderry. And when she arrived, they thought she was a school teacher. And they wouldn't pay any attention to her medical credentials. But eventually she won them over. She was an incredible physician. When she died in her 90s, she was still reading the New England Journal of Medicine every week. She kept up with medicine. She kept up with her former patients. I mean, she, again, was another one of these model family physicians who made it happen. But what's happened with medicine since I came here? Well, I started practicing here, actually, in 1980. But I had worked for Carlos before that. When I came, the healthcare system was Blue Cross Blue Shield, basically, for your health insurance. The hospital care was sort of rudimentary, but that's what Carlos had, and that's what worked. But he also yearned for more and wanted to upgrade as we went along, and that slowly began to happen. But in the course of it happening, doctors used to run hospitals in Vermont. You probably know that. And they had some people working with them who were financial experts and that sort of stuff. But pretty soon, as the insurance industry began to change, And as the government mandates begin to appear, things became different. The heart and soul of medicine is first do no harm, and the second is be there. And those things were getting chipped away at. You know, paperwork started to appear that was totally unnecessary, most of it. The prices started to rise for everything. Healthcare insurance got more expensive and more complex. And that made it very hard for all of you and all of us. And it has not gotten a hell of a lot better, folks, as you've undoubtedly figured out. We're in a mess right now in our healthcare system. We've lost a lot of our ability to care because we're too damn busy sitting there on that computer, you know, punching in stuff and not even looking at you or talking to you when you're in your visit. And that just isn't right. We need to get back to spending the time with you and focusing on you. And one of there's various ways of doing it, you know. If you look at Finland, or if you look at New Zealand, if you look at some of these places that have their own form of national health care, they have what we had. I was in New Zealand a few years ago. They have, in their medical system, what we used to have. The paperwork is shoved down to a minimum. The support of the patient is extremely important to these people, and the health care is magnificent. So I don't know how we're going to get back there, but it sure would be nice if we could. But that's kind of the path that medicine has taken. Bob's love for history is so obvious. You know, he's well aware of all this, and I'm sure he's got some great stories to tell you beyond what he did. Do any of you have any questions for me before I sort of falls off the stage? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I know that Grace is called Grace Cottage Hospital. Is it Grace Cottage Hospital, or is it a cottage hospital like they have in Britain? I've heard.
Cottage hospitals in Britain are a little bit different. Yeah. Grace Cottage Hospital is a hospital.
This is not.
It has been a hospital since you guys found it. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right. There's your break, Mr. Merritt.
Why don't we throw it open to both of you for questions, and you know.
Robert, I'll tell you, I'll say what everybody about.
Yeah, come on. Have both of you up.
I would just like to add that my dad was a GP in Connecticut, started in 1935. Married my mother in 1939. She was a dental technician. They met in the dental office, I guess. He just new to town and meeting the dentist and met her. At any rate, his office visit up through 1961 was $1, and his home visit was $2. And actually, he retired to be a town health officer in about 1965. But his office call was only $1. It went up to $2 in the early 60s. It never went higher. And when I started in Brattleboro in 1973, my office call visit was $8. $8. And when I eventually ended my career 4 years ago, I believe it was in the $60 range. Inflation had done a lot. And I believe I was paid about $45 by Blue Cross Blue Shield. But the $8 I got in 1973 was a heck of a lot more than the $43 I got in 2017. Put it that way. Yeah, Bob, I agree with Bob that we are, one of the most fun things I do is I teach medical students at Dartmouth, and I spend a lot of time talking about, first of all, their self-care while they're medical students, because it's really hard to be a medical student, but they all come with this incredible desire to help humanity. and they're just incredibly wonderful human beings. And there actually has been a tendency for that compassion and that empathy to actually be eroded during the career in medical school. By the 4th year, you don't see as much empathy. You see a lot of fatigue and maybe some cynicism, and we have to it's so important to listen to your patient, to not interrupt, to just make eye contact, to be open in your body language, to care. The secret of really taking care of your patient is to care about your patient. That's the key. That's Osler's, one of Osler's sayings, which is absolutely true. At any rate, it's very, very important, as Bob says, to don't get that computer between you and the patient. You really have to be there entirely for your patient. Bob and I are on the same wavelength, and just like we want to be treated that way, we want our patients to be treated that way. It's extremely important. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you the economy of medicine. My dad was from the same era as Carlos Otis. He had some health problems as he got older. It didn't go as long as Dr. Otis, but at any rate, I can't believe what the GPs did then. The thousands of deliveries, and never, ever, ever. The only thing I'll say is when he was awakened, he was on call all the time. I never had a day off. When he was awakened by a patient at 3 in the morning, he said, "Doctor, I can't sleep." My father, that was the one thing that got him. You can't sleep. No, I can't sleep. I'll be up all night because I'm so upset.
That's funny.
I've noticed in presidential press conferences, they're always given a question, but they always get 2 questions. So I've got a comment for one of you and a question for one of you.
Okay.
The comment was just something, a very tiny thing, but you were talking about the First Nations healthcare, the natives, and the quality of their healthcare, which in some fashions, perhaps because they tried to do less, superseded what the doctors of that period
You heard about the opium story.
were doing.
Yeah.
You also were talking about at Fort Dummer, the first white child who was born, and it brought to mind something that I just learned a couple of days ago, and that was that the first troops at Fort Dummer, when it was built in 1724, half of them were natives from Massachusetts who were friendly to the English. And so half of the people there at the time that first child was born were Native Americans, and some of them may have had their spouses there because the commander had his spouse there.
Sure.
So that first childbirth may have not been totally under the care of a European physician if there was, or a midwife if there was one there. It may have been as much under the care of some of the natives.
Absolutely.
Which I just found kind of fascinating. The question for Dr. Bacus is, what is it, I'm kind of approaching it from the reverse, because everybody talks about, what do we do about our healthcare costs? What is it that countries like New Zealand and other countries, which spend 40–50% of what the U.S. does on healthcare, and tend to have equal or better results by a lot of metrics. What is it about their system that is preferable, at least from a financial standpoint, and seeming from an outcome standpoint is at least as good, if not better? What can be transferred from them to us, rather than us saying, what can we do to change our system? I'm kind of approaching it from the opposite side of the coin.
You have to have a politic that is bicameral. You have to have 2 parties, 3 parties, 4 parties, who all will talk to each other equally with respect and will work together for that kind of an end. That's what it's all about. They have, New Zealand's one of the most conservative countries in the world. When I was there, I'm on a back country road, and this old farmer pulls in and stopped to get a sandwich. And he's asking me about the United States and stuff. And he said, well, he said, we're kind of conservative here, you know. He said, well, we do pretty goddamn well being conservative. And he said, we don't spend as much as you guys do. And we pay our taxes willingly because we see where the money goes every time. We can track it, and it buys us the stuff that we need. We gotta have an attitude, a bicameral attitude, a loving attitude, a sharing attitude in the political world. And I lament, you know, the fact that we don't have that. And there's no reason why we can't have it. It's just damn plain stubbornness. And it's costing us big. What they get out of it is they get discipline, they get their health care paid for, their tax money they feel is well spent, and their people who are staffing their institutions are listeners who have not lost that touch that Bob talks about.
I would just add, I agree with everything Bob says, that I believe that medical care has involved with it too much business. I think the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies are too much involved. There's something very simple about paying for a service with money, as opposed to having a powerful middleman that controls a lot of what goes on and requires you to have a lot of complexities at staff, and, you know, tremendous complexities. I've always thought there's too much business in medicine. I wish there were less. I wish that Medicare would, the rules that they can't negotiate prices of drugs with pharmaceutical companies is absolutely insane to me. That's one of the issues. I just can't believe it. Anyway, I don't think we're going to solve this one right away, but if we can continue to try to have as the most fundamental part of our care, the caring part and the listening part, that's key. And the computer has its challenges, and I think our doctors, our young doctors, are challenged. And most of them are angry because the electronic medical record does not serve the patient or the physician. It only serves the business world of medicine.
Well, and the MBAs now run all of our major hospitals. And as Carlos said to me, when he saw that this was happening, he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think that medicine's going to change in the wrong direction over time," and it has. The MBAs are nice people. They're well trained in finance. But when the doctors ran the hospital, or nurses, there were nurses running hospitals. And when they did that, the human touch seems not to have been left behind. And I don't know, I'm sure there's MBAs with wonderful, you know, compassion and things like that, but there aren't that many. I'm sorry to say.
Other questions? You had one, didn't you?
I have a question. When you look at the medical schools, how many students want to be GP, general practitioners? I feel
Not
that
enough.
they want to specialize.
Well, yeah, a lot of Bob and I are both of the same vein, and we really care so much about the continuity of care and primary care. And it's not enough. There are not enough medical students who want to go into primary care. I think they're too concerned about the exhaustion and the amount of quotes you have to learn, and the income. I mean, I think those are the issues. Bob and I know that the most important thing in medicine is the relationships we have with our patients, who become our friends, and you know that the patients care about us as much as we care about them as time goes on. That's for sure. And ever since I've retired, I've certainly missed that relationship. I see my patients all the time in the stores and everything, but you know, it's not quite the same. At any rate, yeah. that's really.
Well, when I was going through UVM, one of the rotations I went through was cardiac surgery. And the head of the cardiac surgery department was Larry Coffin. How'd you like that?
Dr. Lord.
John
Lord.
John Lord. So he kept trying. He kept beating on me to be a heart surgeon. He says, "You got the skills. You got the mind for it. You can do it easy, and you're going to make 5 times what you'll make as a family physician." I said, "This ain't about money, baby. This is about learning and growing up. And these people are going to grow me up." You guys did.
But it's become about money as many things.
Look at,
Which is,
if you want to be a heart surgeon today, you'll make $1 million your second or third year out.
that
If
is
you want to be a
tempting.
family physician, I don't know what they're paying now to start out.
More than you ever made.
Hell, I made when I retired, I made $169,000 a year,
That's pretty darn good.
and that was damn good money as far as I was
Yeah.
concerned.
I think it's $200,000 if you're a family physician now starting in a center, like a big hospital system. I don't know what it is in Grace Cottage or Brattleboro, but the average is 200,000-ish to start. Yeah.
But what's the debt load coming out
The
of
debt load,
medical school?
the
And
debt
that's-
load is over 100,000 to 200,000 for many of them.
So it's going to take you years to just pay that now.
Took us plenty more
Yeah,
money to pay it
I
off.
know. You know what, it's, money is a vehicle, there's no question, there's some importance, but if you learn how to take care of your money and be a good steward, I think, you don't need very much. You just need to make it work well for you. And, I think a lot of people, unfortunately, the debt load on medical students is very, very high now. So they're thinking, oh my God, how am I ever going to pay that off? I can't be a family physician. So it's somewhat 15% or 20% of the doctors now are going into family medicine now. It's just very low, and it is a wonderful field, and there's so much that there's so much joy in it. And I'll just say one other thing, that I think things changed a bit in terms of collegiality when the primary care physicians didn't continue to take care of the patients in the hospital. And for me, that was a great loss. I really liked it. And it was tiring, but I loved taking care of people in the hospital. And it got to the point where the hospitalists came into the system, and there seemed to be some outcomes, at least financial outcomes for institutions that thought that hospitalists, and hospitalists are very, very good physicians, no question. And there was no rule that, for example, at Brattleboro, I couldn't continue to take care of my patients in the hospital, but most of my colleagues were getting tired of it, and they didn't want to continue. They were given the choice of not continuing to take care of patients versus continuing, and not enough of us wanted to continue doing it to have a coverage system that would allow you to have a life that would be reasonable. So pretty much we all give that. I don't know what it's like in Grace Cottage now.
That's similar.
Yeah, okay.
One of the reasons why it's so expensive is that medical education in New Zealand, in Australia, and in Finland is free. From day one, through the graduation, through the specialty, nothing. So these people feel vetted and invested to give back.
I've got
We keep approaching that, and then get batted down, and we bring it up, terrible idea, Yeah.
One of my former patients he went in medical school, he applied for an Army fellowship that pays for his medical education, and I believe, is going to go into family medicine. That's kind of an example of how your medical education being supported financially. your medical education being supported financially by a larger group such as the United States Army government. I'm really proud of him for doing that, and I'm happy that he's thinking of primary care. You know, it always excites me when a former patient of mine or a former friend of mine goes into primary care, because it's just such a nice thing to go into.
What about the PAs and the APRNs and those guys that they're not full MDs, but a lot of them are practicing in almost that capacity as family physicians? Have you seen a difference in how they take care of patients as opposed to actual MDs?
I'm not sure you can generalize. I think that I have a tremendous respect for all members of the professions, for nurse practitioners. There's clear evidence that nurse practitioners in pediatrics do a better job with physical exams than physicians do.
Mm-hmm.
That's been borne out. I think that whether you're a nurse practitioner, a physician's assistant, a primary care physician, each one of us has its strengths and each one of us has its weaknesses. And I think the best way to do it is work together as teams. And you know, I think that's the way you do it best. And I think being supported, whether I ask Bob about a patient that I'm concerned about, or whether a nurse practitioner asks me, or I ask the nurse practitioner, we can all learn together. We all have different experiences. I think the key is not to get over your head, not to start to do things you're not comfortable with doing. And I think the really good clinicians, whether you're a physician's assistant, nurse practitioner, or primary care physician, or any kind of physician, is to, when you feel like you don't have that answer, either get that answer somewhere, talk to your colleagues, don't have such an ego that you can't ask questions, because it's all about learning every minute of the day. This is being a human being means to learn every day. You're learning something, you learn something new, and you don't know it all, and it's challenging to be an adult, it's challenging to be a human being, whether you're a physician or anything. And I just think that we all, as professionals, have to work together and keep learning from each other and being careful about, making sure we don't go too far, whether you're a primary care physician or anybody. I mean, I've always talked to my colleagues, like Bacus. I mean, we did. That's what people. It's fun to talk to your colleagues about clinical problems. I mean, that's one of the most fun things we do, other than listen to our patients.
I am worried about what happens to the nurse practitioners and the physician's assistants under the current system.
Yeah.
They are pushed very hard to see a number of people, a certain number of people every day.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can't take someone who's just starting out as a physician's assistant, that's 2 years of college, and tell them that they have to act like Bob Tortolani or Bob Bacus. That's just bullshit, pardon my French. It's crazy,
Yeah.
Yeah. And these people are being pushed way too hard and not given the opportunity to grow, as Bob said, through interaction. And they don't get paid very well, and the MBAs love them for that. You can get a PA or a nurse practitioner for what, a quarter of the cost?
Perhaps. Yeah.
And that's a big deal now, all over the country. And of course, then there's some people within those professions who are on a bit of an ego trip who say, yeah, I don't need a doctor, I can do anything. Well, I'm sorry, I'm a doctor, and I couldn't do a lot of things. I get it.
Very good points. Thanks for the question. Oh, yes.
Hi. You had mentioned that there was that many medical schools closed for a 15 or 30-year period. I can't remember. Why is that?
Well, I was mentioning that the University of Vermont had a period of time when they closed. When I was an undergraduate, Brown University had a medical school starting in 1817, and they went for about 30 years. And financially, they went down the tubes, and they never reopened until 1960. UVM closed temporarily. It's all financial. I don't know what specifically the finances were, but I mean, UVM has been really a great medical school, but even in a place like UVM, they did have financial problems. I don't know the details.
Yeah, many of those were linked to a depressed economy at the same time. So there was, that pressure of negative cash flow when you're trying to build something up. You need that cash. And if you're in a depression, it's really hard to do it. And that's why a lot of them kind of tripped over their own feet.
I'm just going to mention something called the Flexner Report, which came out in the 1920s, and there was a lot of evidence that the medical schools in the United States were not up to par, and this fellow looked at medical schools and decided, and really came up with criteria as to what you needed, and the very strong criteria based on what was going on in Baltimore, and where Osler was. William Osler is one of the fathers of medicine at Johns Hopkins. He was the first bedside teaching clinician, and everybody thinks of him as one of the important people in medicine. But the point was that you had this great institution in Baltimore, and you had a lot of other subpar institutions, and actually some of the institutions that really were pretty good were kind of demoted, and there was a tremendous loss of medical schools, and particularly medical schools which were people of color went to a lot of these medical schools, and those medical schools were closed, and a lot of medical schools were closed, but perhaps some of them shouldn't have been closed, and they came up with new criteria that for the most part was probably okay. Something needed to be done, but they might have done too much. There's some controversy about that, but at any rate, that's an interesting thing. I think we should, Flexner, keep that in mind when, if you're going to do some reading. That happened in the 1920s. Yeah. Well, you've been an attentive audience. This is an hour and a half you've been listening. Listen, I wanted to just say, this Bob Bacus here, he's a legend in his time, and he said some things about me which are very nice, and we are a mutual admiration society. I think
have been since we met.
We definitely love primary care. We definitely love taking care of our patients and doing it the right way. And we are both retired. We retired about the same time. We're about the same age, and we hope to continue to be interested in the field of medicine. I'm sure he's still reading his New England Journal sometimes. Even me too.
Well, I just want to say that we are incredibly fortunate to have you both this evening, and I did not intentionally give either of you any real clear sense of what we were looking for, because I didn't want to scare either of you. I had full faith that both of you would.
Now that's unusual for him. Ask his wife.
Don't ever ask.
Oh yeah.
She has this disconcerting habit of telling the truth.
That's right.
I said one thing to Dick when he asked me. I said, Dick, this is August. I don't like doing any preparations for any talks in August. I mean, come on. Dick, I'll be happy to come. I would definitely not say I wouldn't come, but I'm not going to prepare anything. And I basically had to wing it. I just said to myself, I'm not going to spend a lot of time thinking about this. I'm going to just do little notes, go back to what I had. And by the way, please look at all this stuff, this stuff I got there.
All that crap is what you were
All that good stuff there. Yeah. Anyway, I put it out there, so I hope you'll look at it at least part of the time.
You each approached it from a very individual perspective, which is exactly what I was hoping we'd get.
Yeah.
We thank you.
Yeah. You're very welcome. Thank you for your work out there. Appreciate it.
I wanted to thank you.
Yeah, man.
Dennis Brooks. Oh, yeah.